A huge moment for science and humanity. The medical breakthrough the world's been waiting for is almost here. But will it really return life to normal? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is the coronavirus vaccine. It's devastated millions of lives and crushed national economies. But now there's hope that this pandemic could soon be under control. After waiting months, two potential vaccines have emerged at once. Pfizer and BioNTech's joint venture, as well as Moderna, have had major breakthroughs. But while the results are certainly promising, the vaccines still need final approval. Then there's the question of vaccinating an entire planet. So, how close are we really to curing COVID-19? Natalie Pahonen reports.
COVID-19 has come to dominate life as we know it, but the horizon is expanding. A post-pandemic world is coming into view. It's being made possible by science and the global race to find a vaccine. Final trial data from Pfizer and BioNTech shows their vaccine is 95% effective. US firm Moderna says initial results show its candidate is nearly 95% effective. They both still need regulatory approval before they can be distributed, but these results have led to cautious optimism.
Vaccines will help us. What we've got to do is just hang on and continue to do and double down on the public health measures.
So who will be first in line to get a jab? Some governments made bilateral deals with drug companies to get early access to vaccines. The EU has an agreement with Pfizer and BioNTech for 200 million doses and an option for 100 million more. The UK has reserved 100 million doses of AstraZeneca and Oxford University's shot. The US secured 100 million doses of Moderna's vaccine at a cost of about $1.5 billion. It also has the option to buy another 400 million. Many of these governments didn't make just one deal either. They made many. That's been referred to by some as vaccine nationalism, where wealthy countries have prioritized vaccines for their citizens over others and spent money poorer nations simply don't have. There is a risk in preemptively buying doses, because there's no guarantee a candidate will get authorized for use. But in a global crisis, can any nation afford to be at the back of the queue? Over 170 countries have signed up to the World Health Organization's COVAX scheme. It's an initiative for manufacturers to develop and distribute vaccines and make sure there is fair access for all countries, regardless of purchasing power. Once vaccines are approved, there's still a long process ahead. Doses have to be manufactured, the supply chain has to be secured, there have to be enough healthcare workers to administer the shots, and nations will have to prioritise who gets inoculated first. While vaccines could reduce the risk of developing serious illness, researchers need time to study what effect they might have on transmission. The virus is still circulating widely. More than 55 million people have been infected and more than 1.3 million people have died.
A vaccine on its own will not end the pandemic.
The need for individual and collective vigilance hasn't gone away.
Surveillance will need to continue. People will still need to be tested, isolated, and cared for. Contacts will still need to be traced and quarantined. Communities will still need to be engaged, and individuals will still need to be careful. We still have a long road to travel.
Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now in New York by Dr. Eric Feigl-Ding. He's an epidemiologist and senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. Jake Glanville is in San Francisco. He's the CEO and president of Distributed Bio, which is working on treatment for the coronavirus. And in London is Oksana Pyzik. She's a biochemist and senior teaching fellow at the University College London School of Pharmacy. Welcome to you all. Quite an exciting time that we live in these days, isn't it, Eric? We just heard that the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine has proved 95% effective. It has passed all safety checks and is awaiting FDA approval. Usually, Eric, developing a working and effective vaccine takes years. This is quite astonishing considering that we barely had heard of the coronavirus less than 12 months ago, isn't it?
Right. The pace of vaccine development is quite remarkable compared to normal multi-year timeline. Well, obviously, we're in a pandemic and there's massive mobilization of financial resources that is no longer a hurdle. And the number of people willing to volunteer and the number of active infections. Vaccine trials only go as fast as however many infections you have in the community. And sadly, with the surging pandemic worldwide in so many countries, it actually accelerates vaccine trial completion because you'll have more infections to study faster. So there's silver linings, but unfortunately, this is why we need the vaccine so much. And it's very reassuring that the new Pfizer BioNTech vaccine has a 95%, not just the early 90% that was reported last week. And especially among the elderly as 94%, which is a very, very difficult population to immunize. So it's all very hopeful.
So Jake, the concerns on some who say, well, to develop a working and effective vaccine within such a considerably short amount of time is quite astonishing. Perhaps some corners were cut here. What do you tell those people who have those concerns?
Well, this vaccine was developed quickly. Both of the frontline vaccines are RNA-based vaccines. They're developed by reputable companies, and they move quickly, but they didn't cut corners. The technology from a theoretical perspective is pretty safe. They're just giving the spike on the virus, and it's just delivered in RNA, so your own cells produce the spike. So there's not the rest of the virus floating around that could complicate things. And the data has borne that out, that we seem to see the vaccines appear to be well tolerated. So this is the kind of vaccine that I would take and I would recommend for family members to take at this point. Now, our challenge is going to be in convincing those people who have vaccine hesitancy that they too should take this vaccine, because while the vaccine's appearing is definitely good news, we have a significant global challenge on making sure that enough people have financial access, physical access, and are willing to take this vaccine. And until we accomplish that at a global scale, we're going to continue to suffer the pandemic.
And Oksana, if we're looking at the pace, but also effectiveness of these vaccines, both Eric and Jake say, no, they are safe, and it's just due to the urgency that, due to the environment, that this was produced so quickly. You're a scientist, you've been following this development for quite some time. Were you expecting us to have a vaccine by the end of 2020?
I think this is ahead of any other projections, particularly not just in the speed of development, but also just in how the efficacy levels. So already the FDA had approved for emergency use anything that was going to be above 50% efficacy. So to turn around and have two vaccines, both Pfizer and Moderna, come out with almost 95% levels of efficacy is such good news. And just to really reiterate the message around the safety, the standards have not changed. And arguably, the clinical trials that are currently ongoing, there are 210 vaccine candidates that are in total being developed. And this is important because we will need that level of variety for different populations as well, using different technology platforms. And 10 are about in the late stages of phase 3, et cetera. So what the really good news here is that we have more scrutiny of this data than, let's say, any other trial. The eyes of the world are on this to see what is the safety, what is the efficacy, and ultimately what is the effectiveness, which we will only see once it goes into the real world.
Yeah, the eyes on the world are certainly on this, and the world population is eagerly awaiting to have access to this vaccine. Eric, now that BioNTech and Pfizer have sort of made the first step, are about to get FDA approval, realistically speaking, when can we see the first average citizens having access to this vaccine?
Well, they say they will have about 10 million to 12 million doses for the Pfizer vaccine by the end of the year in the US, and then the other half, I think, going to the other countries like the UK. But the first people who will get it will be healthcare workers, essential priority workers. And the US has way more than 10 million or 12 million healthcare workers. So I do not see the average typical American or people in Europe receiving them until springtime. And it's because of the ramp up of the production, because so much material is needed. And also the freezing. The Pfizer vaccine requires really cold cryo-freezing, anywhere from -70 to -94 degrees Fahrenheit, while the Moderna one can be frozen at just -4 degrees Fahrenheit. And by the way, there's other vaccines on the horizon, such as Johnson & Johnson, which is only a single dose and can just be refrigerated. And all these will actually affect, again, once we produce it, the rollout, the more expensive to freeze and distribute, the slower it will be to get into people's arms. But I think by springtime, the general public will be able to start having. I'm not sure if everyone will have it immediately, but it will start to become available.
So by spring 2021, at the earliest, the average public will then have access to it, and we'll get the first people getting vaccinated. Jake, then for those people who are breaking out in jubilation upon this very hopeful and positive news, of course, saying the pandemic is over or is about over and 2021 is saved, is that premature then?
It is. Look, I don't want to play down what is definitely a victory with these vaccines. They both look very effective, and that also means that the other vaccines coming online are likely also to be quite effective. The thing we should be prepared for is a significant amount of confusion in 2021. These vaccines will be rolled out. I think we're looking at 1.3 billion doses by Pfizer, 500 million by Moderna, and if you add those up, that's not enough for the world. There's going to be other companies producing vaccine, but it's going to be a scramble to make sure enough people have access. The other thing to consider is that these vaccines typically take 8 weeks to take effect. So you can't get vaccinated, then go out and have a vaccine party. You have to go wait during those 8 weeks to develop immunity. The other challenges we're going to see is that while these vaccines are reporting 95% effectiveness, a person doesn't really want to know if the vaccine's 95% effective. They want to know if they are protected. And unfortunately, it's somewhat challenging to get an answer to that. At what level in an antibody test, even if you take it, can you assert that you're protected? Another important question is going to be, for how long do these vaccines provide protection? From the live virus infections, we see some concerning data that suggests that immunity after you've been infected wanes over time. Now, the good news here is that there's reasons to believe that vaccines could provide a longer period of protection than 6 months or 7 months. But we just don't know yet, because these are new vaccines, and frankly, this is a new illness. And so we need to watch how long can we enjoy immunity after a live infection versus a vaccine, which will ultimately dictate how often we need to make a new round of batches for the whole world.
So quite a few layers still to go, quite a few obstacles to overtake until we can actually talk cautiously about the end of the pandemic, Oksana. So it means the pandemic will be with us for some time, at least through and including 2021, if I'm hearing Jay correctly.
Yes, this is really important. And I think that some good news after this really long year has been welcome, but we also should be cautious of science by press release. We still need to have full transparency and towards the regulators and having all of that data available. But as Jake also had mentioned, there is going to be the largest pharmaceutical allocation process in history. So this is going to be quite a challenge to get to the whole world, because there is going to, the pandemic will not end if we have large continents in which the virus continues to spread. Viruses know no borders, and with international travel, the cycle of reinfection and reseeding of COVID-19 will just continue, which will also then prolong economic recovery. Now, 80% of the Pfizer vaccine has been bought up by high-income countries. The World Health Organization is working with through the ACT Accelerator and COVAX facility and 186 countries and economies to try and buy up 2 billion doses of vaccines that become available, as well as 500 million different types of diagnostic tests and treatments as well, because that will be necessary as people continue to get ill if they don't have that vaccine protection. So we will not be able to revert back to normal immediately. These public health measures around use of face masks and social distancing will likely stay until we are able to catch up and distribute across the world. And really, unfortunately, we have historically multilateral agreements between governments for vaccine distribution. I'm thinking back to swine flu, and those promises weren't kept. So we have to also be really paying attention towards what would be the best way for all of us to get out of what is a global pandemic and requires cooperation and a global solution.
Indeed, what is the best way, Eric? Because it's quite clear that most politicians, most heads of state, most countries are now trying to get their citizens first in line. We're talking about 200 plus countries in this globalized world, and everybody wants their citizens to get vaccinated and protected first. Do you fear some sense of nationalism, vaccine nationalism taking place, or is it already taking place as we speak?
Yeah, the vaccine nationalism is actually kind of driving some perverse incentives. For example, in some countries, they've already approved their vaccines after phase 2. They didn't even wait for phase 3 before approving it. And that includes, for example, Russia and China. They've already approved it for a sizable population. And that's, again, risky. In addition to inducing vaccine hesitancy, which we might get into, the Russia calls it an arms race, basically, with by naming it Sputnik to evoke the Cold War. In certain ways, it's a sense of pride, but at the same time, this pandemic is not a single country problem; it's a global problem. So by nationalizing it, in certain ways, it basically prioritizes human life of one country over another. And we know that with this virus traveling worldwide, as long as it still exists on Earth, the whole world is still at risk. So I think this nationalism is incredibly, incredibly counterproductive and potentially dangerous, especially when they try to frame it in terms of a Cold War Sputnik language.
Counterproductive and dangerous is what Eric calls vaccine nationalism, but which begs the question, of course, Jake, how do we prevent that? And how do we come up with a level of cooperation so that poorer countries do not stand back at the very back of this line?
Sure. Well, first off, it's essential that we find some solution. If the coronavirus has taught us one thing, it's that there is no problem somewhere else when it comes to this virus. If we neglect any nation, that nation will act as a hotspot that will come back and infect the rest of us again. So we need to solve this. Large-scale consortiums are an effective way to address this matter, and so that we see consortiums being set up, as were just mentioned. There's also foundations like the Gates Foundation and others that could subsidize, and then these nations could also subsidize these vaccines. The good news about vaccines is that they are typically less expensive than therapy. So the challenge, of course, is just getting them into all the areas of the world that need them, to try to convince as many people as possible to take them and to continue developing therapies, with the reality that we will be able to end the large-scale outbreaks, but it is unlikely we will be able to eradicate this virus. And so we need treatments as well to reduce the virus from a pandemic to a manageable infectious disease.
Yeah, a topic that's been dominating certainly our agenda, the news agenda, the political agenda for the past 12 months. Hard to see how politics is not going to be played with this vaccine, Oksana, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, we've had examples of that in the past. And at this stage, what we really need to focus on is also ensuring that should the vaccine access, et cetera, is one part of ending the pandemic, ensuring that public health messaging also continues alongside that, so that we continue to have these modified behaviors around social contact, reducing risks of viral transmission. That will still have to continue for some time. But also, once it becomes available, the other issue is that I think Jake has also mentioned is on the vaccine hesitancy front, and the misinformation, the disinformation that is out there around vaccines, and sort of the short-term collective memory of what polio, even in the U.S., what that was like, what an iron lung, the fact that we eradicated smallpox, the victories of vaccination, the benefits far outweigh any risks that we have seen so far in the data, which are limited to very small side effect profile. So politically, one part is going to be access, and that's going to be something that I think countries are going to have to either learn to cooperate, or this whole pandemic will be prolonged. And the second part is going to be around how we communicate vaccines, how scientists need to really step up in explaining how this works, and really hoping to regain the trust of the public that seems to move towards an anti-science sentiment.
And certainly, I cannot imagine anyone out there who has an interest on having this pandemic prolonged more than absolutely necessary. Eric, both Jake and Oksana rightly mentioned the anti-vaccine movement, the skepticism evolving around vaccines in general. Do you think that this one, because it's such a peculiar one, this pandemic that has dominated every aspect of our lives for the better part of the previous 12 months, do you think this is a vaccine that should be made mandatory?
Well, personally, I do think it should be made mandatory, but I think we should first try to use carrots instead of sticks to induce people to take it, because there's a social network effect with a lot of these public health behaviors. And the faster we actually induce it to be a social phenomenon, that we take it so we can go back to our lives, so our children will go back to school, the actual compliance will be much higher. Because, first of all, the Pfizer and Moderna are 2-dose vaccines. You not only have to convince them to get one jab, but also come back a couple weeks later for the second. And that potentially could yield basically people to fall away and be non-compliant. And ultimately, the mandatoriness will depend how many. And right now in the US, the poll shows 1/3 people say they will, 1/3 say they might not, and 1/3 say they won't. And I think all this is also partly a function of politicization, where, vaccine could have been a political weapon for, re-election, that has scared a lot of people, where they don't want to say they want to take it until leaders like Dr. Anthony Fauci and many other world leaders say, yes, this is safe, that we've seen the data. And I think we're all waiting for that proclamation. Once these trials are formally published, that people are calmed by their nerves and ultimately will take them with high compliance. Because you can have a 100% effective vaccine, but if half the people don't take it, you have a 50% effective vaccine. And it's not vaccines that save people's lives, it's vaccine rollout and treatment programs to actually save people's lives.
So it's very urgent to get everyone on board here, even the skeptics,
yes,
through educated information. Jake, last time you were on the show, you correctly predicted there's not going to be just one vaccine. You turned out to be right, of course. We now have Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna being the first to throw their hats in the ring. How many more do you think are going to be out there being announced in the coming weeks and months? And do you think the more the merrier, the more the better? Is that the philosophy that we're looking at here?
My lucky guess was based on the fact that we knew quite a bit about coronaviruses from SARS and MERS and research that had been conducted. And so we knew that those spikes on the virus were the Achilles heel, and we had reason to believe that vaccines against those spikes would be effective. That's turned out to be the case with Pfizer and Moderna. And to be blunt, I'm glad that there are many other vaccine technologies all being tested, and this data suggests that many of them will also be effective. Now, they each need to be checked. If a different type of vaccine, an alternative virus that has the coronavirus spikes, and an activated vaccine, they would each have different safety profiles. But in general, this data suggests that many of these vaccines are going to be effective, that this virus is susceptible to vaccination. And that's a good thing because it liberates the capacity for greater independent manufacturing at more sites. It protected us a little bit just in case the hypothesis by Regeneron and Moderna, or sorry, Pfizer and Moderna, which were quite similar, was incorrect. It turned out to be correct. And it further enables more nations to have access because different nations can make different deals with these various companies depending on their availability and, frankly, the political relationships between the creating company and the receiving one.
Oksana, we have only 1 minute left until the end of the show, but this is a good time for human mankind, but it is also a good time for science, isn't it?
It's absolutely remarkable the progress that has been made in such a short period of time. Right from identifying the virus, a couple of days later, they were able to map the entire genome digitally, and then 8 weeks later, getting into the first phase 1 trial, really setting a world record. And I think it really shows what is possible. Yes, in let's say quote unquote normal times, it takes much longer, but the world has screeched to a halt, and all of the pharmaceutical industry, researchers, scientists have turned their attention towards one problem. And I think this shows what is possible when we do collaborate and when that sense of urgency is there. But what I think medical ethics still needs to prevail. We shouldn't be making any shortcuts along the way. And I think most countries are in agreement with that.
Eric Feigl-Ding, Jake Glanville, and Oksana Pyzik, thank you so much for joining us and giving your educated take on the coronavirus vaccine. Well, thanks out there for watching. See you next time.